The blood is still warm on her hands. The year is 30 years before the Common Era, the first day of August by the Roman calendar, and the woman kneeling on the marble floor of her mausoleum in Alexandria has just watched the man she built her world around die in her arms. His name was Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony to history, and he has been bleeding out for the past hour from a self-inflicted sword wound to the abdomen, hoisted through a window into this locked tomb because Cleopatra refused to open the doors, because opening the doors would have meant capture, because she knew that Roman soldiers were already surrounding the building and that her kingdom was falling and that everything she had spent 21 years building was being destroyed in the streets outside. She is 39 years old. She has ruled Egypt since she was 18. She has survived the murders of 3 siblings, 2 civil wars, the assassination of 1 Roman lover, and the suicide of another, palace coups, foreign invasions, famines, and plagues. She has borne 4 children. She has commanded armies and fleets. She has been worshipped as a living goddess by millions of subjects who believed she was the incarnation of Isis herself. She has been the wealthiest woman in the known world, the last pharaoh of a dynasty that has ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, the queen whose face was minted on coins from Syria to Cyrenaica. And now she is kneeling in a pool of Antony's blood, her robes soaked through, her hands stained red to the wrists, listening to him take his final breaths, while Roman soldiers pound on the doors of the tomb she has locked herself inside. She can smell the blood, copper, and salt, and something organic that catches in the back of her throat. She can smell the smoke drifting through the high windows from the fires burning in the harbor district where fighting has raged for days. She can smell the incense that her attendants have been burning continuously since she sealed herself in this mausoleum 3 days ago, preparing for a death that she thought would come quickly, but that Octavian's forces have been carefully preventing. She can hear Antony's breathing growing shallower, can hear the sounds of her attendants weeping somewhere in the shadows of the tomb. You can hear the Roman voices outside debating how to breach the building without damaging the treasure they believe is stored inside, treasure that they have been ordered to capture intact. Because Octavian needs Egypt's wealth to pay his armies, and because letting Cleopatra destroy it by fire would be an unacceptable failure. She can feel Antony's weight growing heavier as his strength fades, can feel the warmth leaving his body even as she holds him, can feel something inside herself beginning to fracture in ways that the next 11 days will shatter completely. Because Cleopatra is not going to die today. She is not going to die quickly, cleanly, on her own terms, in the arms of the man she loved. Octavian's soldiers are going to breach this tomb within hours. They are going to capture her alive. They are going to hold her prisoner while Octavian himself travels to Alexandria to personally oversee the next stage of her destruction. And what happens to Cleopatra over the following 11 days, the interrogations, the psychological torture, the systematic destruction of everything she cared about, the fates of her children decided one by one before her eyes, is far more horrific than the romanticized death scene that history has chosen to remember. This is the story of Cleopatra's final days, not the myth, not the legend, not the romantic tragedy that poets and playwrights have crafted from fragments of ancient sources. This is what Plutarch recorded, what Cassius Dio documented, what the ancient historians described in terms that make clear her end was not peaceful surrender, but prolonged psychological annihilation, designed to serve Octavian's political purposes. This is what you are never taught. What you are about to learn has been buried under centuries of romantic mythology that transformed Cleopatra's brutal end into a beautiful death scene. You know the story. Cleopatra, rather than face humiliation at Roman hands, chose to die by her own choice, bitten by an asp, the sacred serpent of Egypt, in a final act of royal dignity. It is one of the most famous death scenes in history, immortalized in paintings and plays and films that show a beautiful queen reclining peacefully as the serpent's venom carries her away. But this romantic version conceals a reality that the ancient sources document clearly. Cleopatra did not choose when to die. She was prevented from dying for 11 days while Octavian systematically destroyed everything she cared about. She did not die peacefully, she died in desperation, racing against guards who had been assigned to prevent her suicide, using whatever method she could manage before they could stop her again. And her death was not the end of her story. It was followed by the destruction of her children, her legacy, her dynasty, her very memory, carried out with calculated precision by the man who would become Augustus Caesar. Tonight, you will discover what the ancient sources actually say about Cleopatra's final days. You will learn about the 11 days between Antony's death and her own days of captivity, interrogation, and psychological torture that the romantic myth has erased. You will learn what Octavian did to her children, one by one, in the weeks and months that followed. You will learn how systematically her memory was attacked, her images destroyed, her name erased from monuments across Egypt. You will learn these things from the ancient historians themselves, from Plutarch, who had access to sources now lost, including the memoirs of Cleopatra's personal physician, from Cassius Dio, who documented the Roman perspective on events, from Strabo, who was actually in Alexandria in the years following Cleopatra's death, from the fragments and references that survive in dozens of other ancient sources, pieced together by modern scholars into a picture very different from the romantic legend. Subscribe if you want to understand what actually happened to one of history's most famous women in her final days. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because Cleopatra is kneeling in Antony's blood, and Roman soldiers are about to breach her tomb, and I am going to tell you exactly what happened next, what the sources document, what she experienced, and what the evidence reveals about a death that was far worse than the beautiful tragedy history has chosen to remember. But first I need to explain how Cleopatra came to be kneeling in that mausoleum, holding a dying man while her kingdom collapsed around her. The Battle of Actium, fought on September 2nd of 31 years before the Common Era, was supposed to determine the fate of the Roman world. On one side was Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, controlling the western half of Rome's territories. On the other side was Mark Antony, controlling the eastern half, allied with Cleopatra and backed by the wealth of Egypt. The battle lasted only a few hours. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was trapped in the Gulf of Ambracia, their supply lines cut, their sailors dying of disease and desertion. When they attempted to break out, their formation collapsed. Cleopatra's squadron fled for Egypt. Antony, seeing her flagship retreating, abandoned his own fleet to follow her. It was a military catastrophe. The fleet they left behind surrendered. The army they left behind surrendered. Within weeks, Antony and Cleopatra had lost everything they had spent years building: the military alliance, the political coalition, the combined might that was supposed to reshape the Mediterranean world. They retreated to Alexandria, but both of them understood that the retreat was temporary. Octavian would follow. He had to follow. As long as Cleopatra lived, she represented a threat, a potential rallying point for resistance, a symbol of the East that might rise again. As long as Antony lived, he represented a rival, a Roman general with a claim to legitimacy that Octavian could never fully suppress while his rival breathed. The year that followed, Actium, was a year of slow collapse. Antony fell into depression and alcoholism, withdrawing from Cleopatra and the court, living in a structure he built extending into the harbor that he called the Timonium, after the famous Athenian misanthrope. He emerged occasionally for wild feasting, but the man who had commanded legions had become a shadow, waiting for an end he knew was coming. Cleopatra, in contrast, worked frantically to salvage something from the disaster. She tried to negotiate separately with Octavian, offering to abdicate if her children could inherit Egypt's throne. She sent him gold, symbols of royal authority, messages proposing various arrangements that might preserve something of what she had built. She explored escape routes and attempted to drag her fleet across the desert to the Red Sea, from which she might flee to India or Arabia, was abandoned when the ships were burned by Arab allies of Octavian. She built the mausoleum where she would eventually die, a grand structure near the Temple of Isis that was designed to house her body and her treasure. She moved much of her wealth into it: gold, silver, precious gems, rare spices, works of art that represented the accumulated treasures of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The building was designed so that it could be sealed from inside and burned, destroying everything it contained if capture seemed imminent. She was preparing for death, but she was preparing for death on her own terms, quick, clean, taking her treasure with her so that Octavian could not use it to pay the soldiers who had destroyed her kingdom. Octavian understood this, and he was determined to prevent it. Octavian's forces arrived outside Alexandria in late July of 30 years before the Common Era. The city was the greatest in the Mediterranean world, larger than Rome, more magnificent than any other urban center, home to approximately 500,000 people living in planned streets and grand buildings that made it the wonder of the ancient world. The defense of the city was hopeless. Antony had gathered what forces he could, but his soldiers were demoralized, his officers were deserting, and the Egyptian population had little enthusiasm for dying in a war between Roman factions. When Antony led a cavalry sortie against Octavian's advance forces, his horsemen defected mid-battle, riding over to the enemy lines. Cleopatra, watching from the palace, understood what the defection meant. The end was coming within hours, not days. She retreated to her mausoleum with her two most trusted attendants, Eros and Charmian, and sealed the doors. She sent a message to Antony telling him she was dead. Why she sent this message has been debated for 2,000 years. Perhaps she believed her death would give Antony the courage to die himself, sparing him the humiliation of capture. Perhaps she wanted to provoke his suicide so that she could negotiate with Octavian alone, without the complication of a living Roman rival. Perhaps the message was garbled or misunderstood. The ancient sources disagree, and we cannot know her intentions with certainty. What we know is the result. Antony, receiving the message, attempted suicide. He ordered his slave Eros to kill him. Eros, unable to strike his master, killed himself instead. Antony then took his own sword and stabbed himself in the abdomen, a wound that was severe but not immediately fatal. While he lay bleeding, a second message arrived from Cleopatra. She was not dead. She was in the mausoleum. She wanted him to come to her. What followed was a scene that even the unsentimental ancient sources describe with evident emotion. Antony was carried to the mausoleum, still alive but fading. Cleopatra, hearing that he was outside but refusing to open the doors because Roman soldiers had already surrounded the building, had him hoisted through a window, a difficult operation that required Cleopatra and her two attendants to pull the wounded man up using ropes, his blood dripping as they struggled with his weight. Plutarch, drawing on sources that may have included eyewitness accounts, describes the scene. Those who were present say that nothing was ever more pitiful than this spectacle. Smeared with blood and struggling with death, he was drawn up, stretching out his hands to her even as he dangled in the air. The task was not easy for women, and Cleopatra, with clinging hands and strained face, could barely manage the rope, while those below called out encouragement and shared her agony. Antony died in her arms shortly after reaching the interior of the tomb. His final words, according to Plutarch, urged her to save herself if she could do so honorably, to trust none of Octavian's associates except one named Proculeius, and to not pity him for his end. since he had been the most famous and powerful of men and was not dishonored to be a Roman conquered by a Roman. Cleopatra was alone now, alone, except for her 2 attendants, locked in a tomb with a dead lover, surrounded by Roman soldiers, her kingdom falling, her children in danger, everything she had built collapsing around her. And the worst was just beginning. Octavian could not let Cleopatra die on her own terms. Her death by suicide, while desirable in some ways, would be a disaster if it happened before he had secured Egypt's treasure. More importantly, her death would deprive him of the centerpiece of the triumph he was planning, the grand parade through Rome, in which the conquered Queen of Egypt would be displayed in chains as proof of his victory. The sources describe the operation to capture Cleopatra as careful and calculated. Octavian sent Proculeius, the one man Antony had said could be trusted, to the mausoleum to negotiate. Cleopatra refused to open the doors, but she spoke with Proculeius through a grating at ground level. She demanded guarantees for her children. She demanded that her kingdom be preserved for her heirs. Proculeius gave soothing answers that promised nothing specific. While Proculeius kept Cleopatra talking at the grating, another officer named Gallus arrived. He continued the conversation, holding her attention, while Proculeius circled to the window through which Antony had been hoisted. With 2 servants, he climbed into the tomb. Cassius Dio describes what happened next. One of the women imprisoned with Cleopatra cried out, "Wretched Cleopatra, you are taken alive!" She turned and saw Proculeius, and attempted to stab herself with a small dagger she kept at her belt for this purpose. But Proculeius ran quickly and seized both her hands, and shook the weapon from her, and searched her clothing to see if she concealed any poison. This was the first suicide attempt. It would not be the last. Cleopatra was captured. She was held in her own mausoleum, while Octavian's officers secured the building and inventoried its contents. She was kept under guard, close guard, constant guard, with orders to prevent any further suicide attempts. And she was made to wait. Octavian did not come to see her immediately. He entered Alexandria in state, addressing the population, reassuring them that the city would not be sacked. He visited the tomb of Alexander the Great, touching the conqueror's preserved face with such clumsiness that he reportedly broke off a piece of the nose. He toured the famous sites. He met with local leaders. He did everything except meet with the captive queen. The waiting was deliberate. Cleopatra had been the most powerful woman in the world. She had made Roman generals and dictators wait on her pleasure. Now she waited a prisoner in her own tomb, surrounded by guards who watched her every movement, denied the death she sought, uncertain when or whether the man who held her fate would condescend to see her. She waited for 3 days before Octavian came. The meeting between Octavian and Cleopatra is described in multiple ancient sources, with details that vary but with consistent elements suggesting a genuine historical core. Cleopatra was ill when he arrived. The ancient sources attribute this illness to grief, self-neglect, and possibly self-injury. She had reportedly been beating her breast in mourning, and the wounds had become infected. She was not the magnificent queen who had seduced Caesar and Antony. She was a grief-stricken, injured, captive woman in her late 30s who had just watched her lover die in her arms and her kingdom fall. Plutarch provides the most detailed account of the meeting. She had only a tunic on and was lying on a pallet bed. When Octavian entered, she sprang up and threw herself at his feet. Her hair and face were in terrible disarray, her voice trembled, her eyes were sunken. The marks of the blows she had given her breast were clearly visible. In a word, her body seemed to be in no better condition than her spirit. Cleopatra attempted to use the strategies that had worked with Caesar and Antony. She appealed to Octavian personally, referring to letters from Caesar that she produced and read aloud. She attempted to stir his sympathy, to remind him of her connection to his adoptive father. She tried, despite her condition, to exercise whatever charm she still possessed. Octavian was unmoved. He was 23 years old, colder and more calculating than Caesar or Antony had been, immune to the personal appeals that had served Cleopatra before. He responded to her arguments with brief, non-committal statements. He told her to be of good cheer, that no harm would come to her. He gave no specific guarantees about anything she actually cared about: her children, her kingdom, her legacy. The ancient sources record that Cleopatra understood during this meeting what her fate was to be. Octavian's evasive answers, his refusal to commit to anything specific, his careful neutrality that concealed implacable purpose, all of it told her that she was not negotiating for her kingdom's future. She was being managed until she could be shipped to Rome for his triumph. Plutarch describes her realization. When she understood what he intended, she said, "I will not be led in triumph." But even this declaration won no response from Octavian, who merely departed with assurances of kind treatment that fooled no one. The meeting lasted perhaps an hour. When it ended, Cleopatra knew what awaited her. The only question was whether she could find a way to die before Octavian could display her in chains through the streets of Rome. The next 7 days were designed to break Cleopatra completely, to crush whatever resistance remained, to make her so desperate that she would accept any fate Octavian chose rather than continue suffering. The techniques Octavian used were psychological rather than physical. He did not need to torture her body. He had something more effective: her children. Cleopatra had 4 living children as Alexandria fell. The eldest was Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, now 17 years old, legally the last male heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and also, by Cleopatra's claim, the legitimate son of Rome's greatest dictator. Cleopatra had sent him south, toward Ethiopia and possibly India, hoping he could escape and eventually return to reclaim his heritage. The other 3 were her children by Antony. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were 10 years old. The youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was 6. Octavian used these children systematically over the next week. First came the news about Caesarion. The 17-year-old had been captured, trying to reach the Red Sea. His tutor had betrayed him, persuaded by Octavian's agents to bring the young man back, with promises of safety that were never intended to be kept. Octavian presented Cleopatra with a choice: acknowledge publicly that Caesarion was not Caesar's son, thereby undermining the claim that threatened Octavian's own status as Caesar's heir, and the boy might live; maintain the claim, and the boy would die. The ancient sources are unclear about exactly how this choice was presented or how Cleopatra responded. What the sources are clear about is the outcome. Caesarion was executed, strangled on Octavian's orders, his body disposed of in ways that the sources do not record. He was 17 years old. Whether Cleopatra knew of her eldest son's death before her own is debated by scholars. Some sources suggest Octavian told her as a final psychological blow. Others suggest he kept the news from her to prevent it from accelerating her suicide attempts. Either possibility is horrific learning of her son's murder in her final days, or dying without knowing his fate while his execution was already ordered. The other 3 children were brought before her during this period. The sources indicate that Octavian allowed Cleopatra to see them, to hold them, to say goodbye not from mercy but as another psychological weapon. Each visit reminded her of what she was losing. Each goodbye was another twist of the knife. The children were not going to be killed, at least not immediately. They were young enough to be useful as hostages, as symbols, as Roman property to be displayed in the triumph that Cleopatra would not live to see. They would be paraded through Rome in her place, wearing the chains she had escaped through death, representing the conquest she would not witness. The guards watching Cleopatra were increased. Her meals were inspected for hidden poison. Her clothing was searched for concealed weapons. Every possible method of suicide was anticipated and blocked. Octavian needed her alive alive until she could be transported to Rome, alive until she could walk in chains before the Roman mob, alive until her humiliation was complete. The sources describe her condition deteriorating over these days. She was not eating, or eating minimally. She was not sleeping, or sleeping in fits interrupted by guards who checked constantly to ensure she was still alive. The wound infections on her chest from her self-inflicted morning injuries were apparently not properly treated. Octavian may have calculated that allowing her to suffer non-fatal illness served his purposes. She was being broken. Not quickly, not cleanly, but systematically every hope extinguished, every comfort removed, every person she loved threatened or taken, every possible escape blocked. By the 11th day, she was ready to attempt her final escape by whatever means she could manage. The traditional story says Cleopatra died from the bite of an asp, an Egyptian cobra, sacred serpent of the pharaohs, hidden in a basket of figs and smuggled into her prison. It is a beautiful image. The queen choosing the royal serpent as her instrument of death, departing life through sacred venom that connected her to the gods she had served. But the ancient sources tell a more complicated story. Plutarch, who had access to the best sources, including potentially the account of Cleopatra's physician, admits that no one actually knows how she died. The truth of the matter no one knows, for it was also said that she carried poison in a hollow hairpin, which she kept hidden in her hair. Yet no swelling or other sign of poison appeared on her body. Moreover, no serpent was seen, though some said they saw its trail leading toward the sea. Some say 2 faint puncture marks were visible on her arm. Cassius Dio is equally uncertain. No one knows clearly in what way she perished. The only marks on her body were slight pricks on the arm. Some say an asp had been brought to her in a water jar, or perhaps among flowers. Others say she had smeared a pin with poison and then pricked her arm. What the sources agree on is that Cleopatra found a way to die despite the precautions Octavian had taken to prevent it. She sent Octavian a message, possibly a letter, possibly a verbal communication, and then acted quickly before anyone could stop her. The message asked Octavian to allow her to be buried with Antony. The request was itself a signal, a clear indication that she was about to die, sent at the last possible moment, when it would be too late for the guards to prevent her death. When Octavian received the message, he sent men racing to her chambers. They arrived too late. The scene they found has been reconstructed from the ancient accounts with variations but with consistent core elements. Cleopatra was dead, lying on a golden couch, dressed in royal robes, wearing the symbols of her office. Eris, one of her attendants, was already dead at her feet. Charmian, the other attendant, was dying, barely able to stand, adjusting Cleopatra's crown with failing hands. One of Octavian's men cried out, "A fine deed, this, Charmian." Charmian replied, with her last breath, "It is indeed most fine, and fitting for one descended from so many kings." The image of dignified death, the queen choosing her moment, her attendants dying with her, the final defiant words, has shaped how history remembers Cleopatra's end. But this dignified death was achieved only through desperate smuggling, through deception of the guards, through a race against time that nearly failed. And it was not the end of the horror. Cleopatra died hoping that her death would protect her children, that by removing herself from Octavian's calculations, she would eliminate the reason for harming them further. She was wrong. Caesarion, her eldest, was already dead or about to die. Octavian reportedly justified the execution with a line from Homer, twisted to his purposes. Too many Caesars is not a good thing. The 17-year-old, who was legally both the last Ptolemaic pharaoh and the son of Julius Caesar, could not be allowed to live. He was strangled, and his body was disposed of in ways that left no tomb, no memorial, no evidence that he had ever existed. The 3 younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were shipped to Rome. They were paraded in Octavian's triumph, walking in chains through streets lined with Romans cheering their humiliation. They were displayed as trophies, as proof of Octavian's victory, as symbols of the conquered East. After the triumph, they were given to Octavia, Octavian's sister, and, in bitter irony, the legal wife whom Antony had abandoned for Cleopatra. Octavia raised them in her household alongside her own children and the other children of Antony's previous marriages. The boys disappeared from history within a few years. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus are not mentioned in any source after the triumph. They presumably died young, though whether from natural causes or something more deliberate cannot be determined. They were, after all, the sons of Antony and Cleopatra, potentially dangerous symbols if they lived to adulthood. Their quiet disappearance from the historical record is itself suspicious. Only Cleopatra Selene survived to adulthood. She was eventually married to Juba II, a client king whom Octavian installed as ruler of Mauritania in North Africa. She lived until approximately 5 years before the Common Era, bearing children and ruling a minor kingdom far from Egypt. She named her son Ptolemy, after her dynasty. She decorated her capital with Egyptian imagery, preserving what she could of her mother's heritage. She was, in a sense, the only piece of Cleopatra's legacy that survived a daughter ruling a minor African kingdom, keeping alive the memory of a dynasty and a mother that Rome had tried to erase. Cleopatra's physical death was only the beginning of her destruction. Octavian systematically attacked her memory throughout Egypt and beyond, attempting to erase her from history while simultaneously using her as propaganda. In Rome, she became the villain of official histories, the foreign seductress who had corrupted first Caesar and then Antony, the enemy queen who had threatened Roman civilization, the embodiment of Eastern decadence and feminine danger that Roman masculinity had righteously conquered. This image served Octavian's political purposes and became the dominant narrative for Roman readers. In Egypt, the erasure was more literal. Cleopatra's name was removed from monuments throughout the country. Cartouches bearing her titles were chiseled out. Statues were torn down or modified. The temples she had built were rededicated, her images replaced with those of the Roman emperors who followed. The systematic destruction was thorough enough that relatively few contemporary images of Cleopatra survive today. Her mausoleum, the building where she had died, was apparently destroyed or repurposed. Its exact location is unknown to modern archaeology. The tomb where she was buried alongside Antony, which Octavian permitted as a final gesture, has never been found. Whether it was deliberately hidden, destroyed, or simply lost over centuries of urban development in Alexandria cannot be determined. Even her method of death was disputed and mythologized. The story of the asp, the sacred serpent, may have been promoted because it fit the narrative of a queen dying through divine agency, removed by the gods she had falsely claimed to represent. The uncertainty in the ancient sources may reflect deliberate obfuscation, an attempt to make her death mysterious and exotic rather than simply desperate. Egypt itself was not annexed as a normal Roman province. It became the personal property of the emperor, too wealthy and too strategically important to be governed by potentially rival senators. The grain that fed Rome's population, the gold that paid Rome's armies, the trade routes that enriched Rome's merchants, all of it flowed from Egypt. All of it was controlled directly by the man who had conquered Cleopatra. Her kingdom became his treasury. Her subjects became his laborers. Her legacy became his propaganda. Everything she had built, everything she had preserved, everything she had fought for, was absorbed into the Roman system that she had spent her life trying to balance against, to manipulate, to survive. Let me examine in detail what the ancient sources tell us about Cleopatra's final days, because the evidence reveals dimensions of her experience that the Romantic legend has obscured. Plutarch's Life of Antony provides the most detailed account. Plutarch wrote approximately 130 years after Cleopatra's death, but he had access to sources now lost, including apparently the memoirs of Cleopatra's physician Olympus, who was present during her final days. Plutarch describes details that suggest eyewitness testimony: the difficulty of hoisting Antony through the window, Cleopatra's physical condition during her meeting with Octavian, the conversation with Charmian as she died. Cassius Dio's Roman history, written approximately 240 years after the events, provides the Roman perspective. Dio had access to official records and earlier histories, and his account emphasizes Octavian's calculated management of Cleopatra's captivity, the careful prevention of suicide, the psychological manipulation, the political purposes served by keeping her alive and then allowing her death at the optimal moment. Strabo, the geographer, was actually in Alexandria within a few years of Cleopatra's death. His references are brief but valuable because they come from someone who saw the city and spoke with people who remembered the events. His account confirms the basic outline while adding geographical and cultural context. Appian's Civil Wars, written in the 2nd century of the Common Era, provides additional details about the military and political context, including the campaigns that preceded Alexandria's fall and the fate of Cleopatra's forces. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing approximately 70 years after Cleopatra's death, had access to sources in the Herodian archives that preserved correspondence between Cleopatra and various rulers of the region. His brief references add context about her diplomatic activities during her final years. What all these sources agree on is that Cleopatra's death was not the peaceful transition that romantic legend suggests. She was a prisoner. She was prevented from dying for 11 days. She was psychologically tortured through her children, her isolation, her uncertainty. When she finally managed to die, it was through desperate measures that barely succeeded despite the precautions against her. The sources also agree that her death was only the beginning of her destruction. Her son was executed. Her younger children were paraded as trophies and then disappeared. Her memory was attacked throughout Egypt. Her kingdom was absorbed. Everything she had built was dismantled by the man who would become Augustus Caesar, founder of an empire that would last for centuries on the foundations that included Egypt's wealth and Egypt's grain. Modern archaeology has attempted to find physical evidence of Cleopatra's final days, with limited but suggestive results. Her tomb has never been found. Archaeologists have searched Alexandria and the surrounding region for decades, following various theories about where she might be buried. The most recent major effort, led by archaeologist Kathleen Martinez, has focused on the temple complex at Taposiris Magna, approximately 30 miles west of Alexandria. Martinez has found evidence of Ptolemaic-era tombs in the complex, but no definitive identification of Cleopatra's burial has been established. The absence of her tomb is itself significant. Alexandria has been continuously inhabited for over 2,000 years, with each generation building on the ruins of the last. The ancient harbor district, where Cleopatra's palace complex was located, is now largely underwater due to earthquakes and subsidence. Many ancient structures have simply disappeared beneath later construction or beneath the Mediterranean Sea, but the absence may also reflect deliberate concealment or destruction. Octavian had reasons to ensure that Cleopatra's tomb did not become a pilgrimage site, a focal point for resistance, a place where her memory could be preserved and honored. Whether he actively destroyed or concealed her burial, or whether it simply vanished through natural processes, cannot be determined. Underwater archaeology in Alexandria's harbor has uncovered fragments of the royal quarter where Cleopatra lived. Statues, columns, and architectural elements have been mapped on the seabed, providing evidence of the magnificence that she knew. Some of these fragments may have been part of her mausoleum or her palace, but the connection to specific events described in the ancient sources remains speculative. Coins bearing Cleopatra's image survive in substantial numbers, providing the most reliable contemporary evidence of her appearance. These coins show a woman with a strong nose, a prominent chin, and a determined expression, not the great beauty of legend, but someone whose face reflected the intelligence and force of will that the sources describe. The temple reliefs that survive, particularly at Dendera, where Cleopatra is depicted alongside Caesarion, show her in traditional Egyptian pharaonic style. These images tell us more about Egyptian artistic conventions than about her actual appearance, but they confirm her role as a pharaoh in the full Egyptian tradition, a living goddess, the incarnation of Isis, the legitimate ruler of a kingdom that traced its heritage back millennia. Modern psychologists and historians who have analyzed Cleopatra's final days recognize patterns that illuminate her experience beyond what the ancient sources explicitly describe. The initial shock of Antony's death, combined with immediate capture and the prevention of her suicide attempt, would have produced acute traumatic response. She had watched her lover die in her arms after hoisting him through a window while wounded and bleeding. She had been seized immediately after, her attempted suicide foiled, her control over her own death denied. The following days of captivity featured conditions that modern psychology recognizes as deliberately traumatic. Isolation from all support networks, except guards who watched her constantly. Uncertainty about her fate and the fate of everyone she loved. Confrontation with her captor that confirmed her worst fears. News, or the threat of news, about her children that kept her in constant anxiety. The pattern matches what modern interrogators would recognize as psychological torture, the deliberate infliction of mental suffering to achieve specific purposes without leaving physical marks. Octavian did not need to have Cleopatra beaten or starved. He could break her more effectively by controlling information, by managing her access to her children, by keeping her alive against her will, while systematically destroying everything she cared about. Her final suicide can be understood as escape from circumstances that had become unbearable, not the dignified choice of a queen preserving her honor, but the desperate act of a woman who had endured 11 days of psychological torture and could not face what awaited her in Rome. The triumph that Octavian planned would have been the culmination of her humiliation. Roman triumphs featured conquered enemies led in chains through jeering crowds, sometimes killed at the end of the parade, sometimes imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Cleopatra would have walked or been carried if she could no longer walk through streets filled with Romans celebrating her destruction. She would have been displayed as a trophy, a symbol, an object lesson in the fate of those who defied Roman power. That she found a way to die rather than face this fate speaks to both her desperation and her determination. The method was whatever came to hand poison, perhaps, or a venomous snake, or some combination that the sources cannot clearly establish. The dignity was imposed after the fact by the careful arrangement of her body and robes and crown, by Charmian's final words, by the narrative that survivors and historians constructed from the chaos of her last moments. Let me examine in more detail what happened to each of Cleopatra's children, because their fates complete the horror of her final days. Caesarion was 17 years old when his mother died. He was the legal pharaoh of Egypt, the son of Julius Caesar, according to his mother's claim, the last legitimate male heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty. He was also the most dangerous of Cleopatra's children to Octavian, a living reminder that someone other than Octavian had a claim to be Caesar's heir. Cleopatra had sent him south with a substantial treasury, hoping he could escape to India or Arabia and perhaps someday return to reclaim his heritage. His tutor, Rhodon, persuaded him to turn back with promises that Octavian would allow him to rule Egypt. The promises were lies. Caesarion was captured, brought before Octavian, and executed. The ancient sources provide few details about his death. He was probably strangled, the standard Roman method of executing high-status prisoners. His body was disposed of without public funeral or tomb. He disappeared from history as if he had never existed, which was precisely Octavian's intention. Alexander Helios was 10 years old, the eldest of the twins, born to Cleopatra and Antony. He had been proclaimed king of Armenia, Media, and Parthia in a grand ceremony in Alexandria, titles that were more symbolic than real, but that indicated his parents' ambitions for him. He was paraded in Octavian's triumph, and then he disappeared from history. No source records his death, but no source records his continued existence either. He simply vanishes from the record, presumably dying young in circumstances that no one bothered to document. Ptolemy Philadelphus was 6 years old, the youngest of Cleopatra's children. He, too, was paraded in Octavian's triumph, wearing the traditional costume of a Macedonian king that emphasized his heritage and his parents' pretensions. Like his brother Alexander, he disappeared from history after the triumph. No source records what happened to him. The silence is itself ominous. Cleopatra Selene was the only one of Cleopatra's children to survive to adulthood and leave a mark on history. She was 10 years old when her mother died, paraded in the triumph alongside her brothers, and then raised in Rome in the household of Octavia. She survived, perhaps because she was female and therefore less threatening, perhaps because she was useful as a political tool. She was eventually married to Juba II, a Numidian prince who had been raised in Rome after his father's defeat and who had become thoroughly Romanized. Octavian, now Augustus, installed them as client rulers of Mauritania, a kingdom in North Africa far from Egypt, but not so far that Cleopatra Selene could not bring Egyptian influence to her court. She ruled for approximately 20 years, dying around 5 years before the Common Era. She bore at least 2 children, including a son she named Ptolemy, after her dynasty. She filled her capital with Egyptian imagery and symbols, preserving what she could of her mother's heritage in a minor kingdom at the edge of the Roman world. She was the living legacy of Cleopatra, the one child who survived, who married, who bore children, who ruled however briefly and however distantly. Through her, something of Cleopatra's bloodline continued, though the kingdom of Egypt itself was gone forever. What survived Cleopatra's final days? Her children, mostly, did not. Caesarion was executed. Alexander and Ptolemy disappeared. Only Selene lived to adulthood, and her line ended when her son Ptolemy was executed by the Roman Emperor Caligula approximately 70 years after Cleopatra's death. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, was extinguished. Her kingdom did not survive. Egypt became Roman property, not even a province in the normal sense, but the personal estate of the emperor, governed by his appointees, its wealth flowing directly to Rome. The independence that Cleopatra had fought to preserve was gone. Egypt would not be independent again for nearly 2,000 years. Her image was systematically attacked. Throughout Egypt, her name was removed from monuments, her statues destroyed or defaced, her memory targeted for erasure. What survives coins, a few reliefs, scattered references in texts, is a fraction of what once existed. But her story survived. The ancient historians preserved accounts of her final days that, for all their limitations and biases, provide evidence of what she experienced. The romantic legend that developed from these accounts distorted her death, but also ensured that she would never be forgotten. She became a symbol of Egypt, of the exotic East, of feminine power, of tragic love, of defiance against overwhelming force. Different eras have interpreted her differently. To medieval Europeans, she was a cautionary tale about female sexuality. To early modern playwrights, she was a romantic heroine. To modern audiences, she is a complex historical figure whose actual life was more interesting than any legend. What she wanted to survive, her children, her kingdom, her dynasty, did not survive. What survived instead was her fame, her image, her story, retold across 2,000 years by people who found in her final days something that mattered to them, something worth remembering, something worth telling again. For Cleopatra's seventh, Philopator, who was 39 years old when she died, who had ruled Egypt for 21 years, who had survived the murders of 3 siblings in 2 civil wars, and the assassination of 1 lover and the suicide of another before her kingdom finally fell. For the woman who held Mark Antony as he died, his blood soaking her robes, his weight growing heavier as his life faded, while Roman soldiers pounded on the doors of the tomb she had locked herself inside. For the prisoner who was captured alive against her will, whose suicide was prevented, who was held for 11 days while everything she cared about was systematically destroyed around her. For the mother who watched her children taken from her, who learned or feared that her eldest son would be executed, who could not protect the 3 who remained from the fate that awaited them in Rome. For the queen who would not walk in chains through the streets of Rome, who found a way to die despite the guards assigned to prevent her death, who managed one final act of defiance before the doors could be breached. For Iris and Charmian, her attendants who died with her, who smuggled whatever poison or serpent allowed her escape, who adjusted her crown with failing hands and answered the Roman soldier's question with words that history has remembered. It is indeed most fine, and fitting for one descended from so many kings. For Caesarion, who was 17 years old, who was strangled on Octavian's orders, who was erased from history so thoroughly that no tomb marks where he lies. For Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, who were 10 and 6 years old, who were paraded as trophies through the streets of Rome, who disappeared from history into silence that conceals whatever fate they met. For Cleopatra Selene, who was 10 years old when her mother died, who alone survived to adulthood, who ruled a minor kingdom far from Egypt, and named her son after her lost dynasty, who was the last carrier of Cleopatra's blood into the future. She was not the seductress of Roman propaganda. She was not the romantic heroine of later legend. She was a ruler, intelligent, capable, determined to preserve what she had inherited and expand what she could. She failed. She failed because her enemies were stronger, because Actium was a disaster, because Octavian was cold where Caesar and Antony had been warm. She failed because the forces arrayed against her were simply too great for any one person to withstand, even a person of exceptional ability and exceptional resources. But she did not fail quietly. She did not surrender. She fought until there was nothing left to fight for, and then she died rather than provide her conqueror with the final satisfaction of displaying her in chains. This is what Cleopatra's final days actually looked like. Not the beautiful death scene of legend, not the peaceful queen choosing her moment with royal dignity, not the romantic tragedy that poets have preferred to remember. 11 days of captivity, 11 days of psychological torture, 11 days of watching everything she had built destroyed, every person she loved threatened or taken, every hope of survival or escape systematically extinguished, and then a desperate death, achieved through whatever means came to hand, in a race against guards who are already running to stop her. The mausoleum where she died has never been found. The method of her death remains uncertain. The fates of her children disappeared into silence or obscurity. But she is remembered. Across 2,000 years, through countless retellings that have distorted and romanticized and mythologized her story, she is remembered. Not as she wished to be remembered as a goddess, as a pharaoh, as the mother of a dynasty that would rule Egypt for centuries more, but remembered nonetheless. Her face on coins that collectors treasure, her story in histories that scholars study, her legend in the culture of peoples who never knew Egypt, who have never seen the Nile, who would not recognize Alexandria if they stood in its streets. She wanted to be remembered as a queen. She is remembered as something more complex, a woman who fought against forces that were too strong for her, who lost everything she cared about, who died rather than submit. Remember her. Remember what she endured. Remember, subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know Cleopatra's story, but has only heard the romantic version. The legend is beautiful. The reality is horrific. The woman deserves to have both remembered the death she wanted to have and the death she actually endured. Remember her.